Do you know who sings that song?
And knowing you, it's going to be like ZZ Top or something crazy.
No. Remember have you seen the new Twisters movie?
I have, yes.
Jelly Roll. It's in that song when
Okay.
it's I can't think of the main dude's name. It's when he
Glenn
first
Powell.
yeah, when he's driving
Yeah.
his truck and that song's playing. So, anyways, I wrote this poem for you, and
Yes.
so uh I haven't read it to anyone else, so you're gonna be hearing this for the first time, and so is everyone else. I call the poem 10,000. So I hope you like it. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. You want me to keep going? It's called 10,000. So,
I mean, we got an hour. You could probably get there.
I might be able to. I'd probably have to pick up the pace, but
Oh God, that was good. That's not what I was expecting, but that was
here
on a day like today. I really appreciate that.
Of course. And what I'll even do one even better for you, since we can't really, I can't finish it here. I'll just call you up later and I'll finish the rest of it if you want to see how the rest of it goes.
I'll put you on speaker while I'm at the gym and everybody can hear it.
Yes, please, because I know that cutting it short like that is a big cliffhanger for you, and I don't like unresolved stories. So,
before we get into this, I have to tell you my dad joke that I told today at our tech meeting.
Now's the time.
What do a tick and the Eiffel Tower have in common?
They're
both parasites.
I hate myself for wanting to laugh. It like hurts inside. Oh man.
You're welcome.
What were we talking about again? What's this episode? Oh yeah, all about fats. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll try to make the rest of this relevant so that you're not wasting your time today.
Bingo.
But we're going to talk about fats, and we're going to talk about their role, how to make healthy choices, what exactly that means, how fats fit into your diet, what fats do, why they're important. We'll talk about why they're an essential part of your diet. They're misunderstood by a lot of people. So we're going to bust some facts and talk about the different types of fats, practical tips for including healthy fats and limiting some of the quote unquote bad ones, which we'll get to and we'll define a little bit later. But should be a good episode for you guys. And we'll just dive right in. And we can start by defining exactly what fats are. And probably the best person suited to do that would be the guy with the PhD. So, Brad, tell us, what is a fat and how is it defined, chemically and scientifically and all that?
So fats they're really defined based on kind of their structure and their function. Very similar to carbohydrates, right? I think, did we talk about carbohydrates last week or was that the week before?
We've had an episode on protein and carbohydrates. Yep.
Yeah, so similar to proteins, they're defined by their structure and effectively their function. But what's really interesting, the term fats, especially in nutrition, we use the word fats rather generally and incorrectly to describe a large group of nutrients, when in reality, fats is actually a subtype of a nutrient. So the correct term that we think about is lipids, with fats being a subcategory of lipids. And so there's kind of two major categories of lipids and a couple categories under that. So there's what we would call structured lipids and storage lipids. So structured lipids are things like sterols. So think cholesterol, right? Cholesterol, sterol, and phospholipids. So what do you remember from like elementary school biology class about cell membranes? What are they?
Oh, geez. I mean,
they are semi-permeable phospholipid bilayers.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Thank you.
Yes. So phospholipids are a type of fat that make up our cell membranes. So those are structured lipids. Then we have storage lipids, which are what we think about primarily when we talk about like nutrition fats. Those are triglycerides and fatty acids, which fatty acids just get stored as triglycerides. So when we talk about fats, we're actually talking about lipids in general, and we consume phospholipids, we consume sterols and cholesterol and plant sterols, and we consume triglycerides and fatty acids. So we actually consume lipids, not just fats.
Yeah, so because you mentioned cholesterol, you've also got uh, the adipose tissue, body fat. So, but lipids would categorize everything, was what you're saying, and then you break down based on those lipids. Here are the subtypes. So if you were to chart that out, essentially, you've got lipids at the top, and then everything else is a subcategory of that, and they branch off, and there's different types and all that. Okay, yep, gotcha.
Exactly.
So the types of fats that people are, let's talk about dietary fats, saturated fats, unsaturated fats. You've got trans fats. I mean, there's also, and then I think that there are subcategories of those, right? You've got polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, all that kind of stuff. The like, for example, saturated fats, animal sources is a big one. Like if I go eat a steak, we talked about steak recently. I love filet. It's like my favorite cut of meat, but it's high in saturated fat. You've got unsaturated fats, which are things like olive oil, avocado, which is I love avocado, but those are kind of your monounsaturated fats. You've got polyunsaturated, which I believe are like omega-3s. Correct me if I'm wrong. Are there any other that I'm missing? Just kind of the main ones.
Yeah, so I think maybe the best way to understand this is when we talk about those fats, those are all types of triglycerides or free fatty acids, right?
Right.
And the difference between saturated fats and unsaturated fats is just how the carbons in the chain are
just how it's structured.
Yeah, so when we talk about like carbohydrates, right? We talked about those were individual sugar molecules that were simple sugars and then would be built into longer chains. Fats are very similar in that they have these carbon atoms that then build these long chains. And the difference between a saturated fat is in a saturated fat, all of the carbons have all of their bonds fully saturated. So they all have 4 bonds. Right? I don't know if you guys remember intro chemistry, but carbon can form 4 bonds basically. And well, 8 bonds, but sort of depends. But basically a carbon is fully saturated with its bonds. A unsaturated fat it's missing one of those bonds. So one of the bonds is going to be a double bond, right? So all that's different between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat is it's missing either one hydrogen, so it has one double bond, which is mono, or it's missing many, which is poly. And the difference in those and why it's important to know that is saturated fats are chemically more stable, which means they are more likely to be solid at room temperature.
Right.
And they usually have a higher smoke point, generally.
Okay.
So some examples of those are like animal fats. So a lot of like the fats that you see like in your meat and things like that are generally saturated, not all of it. Like coconut oil, which is solid at room temperature, butter, those are generally higher in saturated fats. Now, they all are metabolized a little bit differently by the body, and some of the specific polyunsaturated fats have specific roles in the body, like they are slightly anti-inflammatory, like the omega-6s. So that's just kind of how we think about structuring the different fats, like biochemically speaking.
Yeah, we talked about, I don't know if it was the last episode or if it may have been several episodes ago. I think maybe it was the cholesterol one where I brought up trans fats. We talked about it briefly. And one of the things that you had said was, I don't know if it was the World Health Organization or if it's the CDC. No, not the CDC. That doesn't make sense. The FDA, excuse me. That they had mentioned, they had classified trans fats as no longer safe for consumption. But is it the FDA? Am I right?
So it's more of they are removed from the generally recognized as safe list.
Okay, so they're not. So they're not banned. I mean, they're still in foods. So trans fats. What I'm curious about. One of the questions I had gotten. We can address that now since we're talking about the types of fats, and that is trans fats. Like, should I completely avoid them? Trans fats, we know they are essentially artificially hydrogenated fats that you usually find in processed foods. What I think that I don't know, and I don't think a lot of people know, is why do they have a negative impact on our health? What is it about the trans fats that is so bad for us?
So before we dive into those exact answers, I think maybe the best way to really understand them is to understand how they came into existence and why they became so important and etc. So we just talked about uh, saturated fats being more stable at room temperature, right? So what that means is they're less likely to go rancid if they're sitting out, which means they're more shelf stable. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In the 70s and 80s, there was some early data that was not super high quality data that basically said that higher intakes of saturated fat were associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, right? Now we've learned quite a bit since then, and there's a lot of nuance to that, but regardless, that led us to trying to reduce saturated fat in the American diet. But that meant that a lot of the shelf stable things that use saturated fat we could no longer have. So we developed these
Gotcha.
trans fats, which are mono or polyunsaturated fats that have been altered their structure. So that bond is actually the opposite. So instead of in chemistry, there's cis bonds and trans bonds. This is nothing to do with politics, but like just those are how you like the symmetry of the bond, right? So when you change these polyunsaturated or monounsaturated fats from having a cis bond, the double bond being a cis bond, to a trans bond, it makes them more stable. So they're more shelf stable. So basically, that's why you can take these usually liquid oils, make them trans fats, and now they have the same consistency as butter. That's where the I can't believe it's not butter stuff came from, right? So now we had a replacement for that food in that shelf stable fat in the American diet without it being saturated fat. Like, that's the history of how these things were developed and why they were developed. We thought they would be great, but it turns out the body processes these much differently than the other fats. We believe it's linked to LDL cholesterol levels and inflammation, and it increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, there's been very few things in the nutrition science literature that give us a very clear, strong, clinically meaningful signal. There were a handful of studies. The three main ones around trans fats were called the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, the Zufin Elderly Study, and the Nurses Health Study. And all of these studies tracked trans fat intake over time and the risk of myocardial infarction. And with the exception of the Health Professionals Study, which it showed an effect, but it wasn't statistically significant because there were such large variances because the sample size was a little bit smaller. But for every 2% increase in total daily energy from trans fats, so that would be in a 2,000 calorie a day diet, I got to do the math here, times 0.02, that's 40 calories, which is what, 4.5 grams of trans fat per day. Your risk of having a non-fatal myocardial infarction and fatal coronary heart disease was upwards of 30 to 50%. So these were meaningful increases in risk from modest, consistent trans fat intakes.
So not to simplify things, but essentially what you're saying is that trans fats came along as a way to substitute the lack of to increase shelf life. Essentially, is that
Yeah.
a fair summary of it. It's crazy. So
Yep.
yeah, yeah,
And
that's just
so
that does not seem like a worthy trade-off to me. But
yeah. And so I'll just read, here's a very brief summary of these things. And this is a review paper that was published in Trends in Cardiovascular Medicine back in 2016. And one of the paragraphs on this says dietary trans isomers of fatty acids increase the ratio of LDL cholesterol to HDL cholesterol in the blood and thereby increase cardiovascular disease risk. Additionally, mechanistic studies have demonstrated that trans fatty acids upregulate inflammatory processes and induce endothelial dysfunction. So that's kind of how they work.
Logic and all that. And that last bit, pure gibberish.
So that's one of the
interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's actually fairly clear in the nutrition literature.
So I also just I'm going to share my screen because you mentioned I can't believe it's not butter. Have you ever seen some of the knockoff brands of
No.
I can't believe? Okay, check this out.
Oh my god!
These are some of the knockoff brands of I can't believe it's not butter.
I knew today was going to be a weird day, so
you
what?
Think it's
not
butter?
Better? You think it could be butter?
Which of these would you buy if you saw it in the store? I really like.
What's crazy is
this is not
like,
butter.
This is what used to be in our house in like the 90s. Like we grew up on this.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Did you ever hear the myth that margarine was one molecule away from plastic? Have you ever heard people say that? It's I mean it's obviously a load, but yeah, I thought it was funny. But okay, before we move on, you got to tell me which of these you would pick. You have all these 6 in front of you at the store, and you need margarine. Which one do you get?
Memories of butter, because that sounds like a Bob Ross painting.
Oh my God! Wow. People are gonna think we are so easily amused. They're gonna stop watching. Okay.
I'm choking on my water.
Oh man.
I'm sorry, I just end the show right there.
I don't. I just picture him like with his paintbrush about to draw. Okay, I can't. I'm really sorry. I gotta apologize to our viewers. This is ridiculous.
This may be the most entertaining episode we've done. Not on purpose.
Yeah. If you guys missed my awesome poem at the beginning, please make sure to watch this back after we're done and catch the beginning. It's a sweet poem. It's called 10,000. All right. We're going to try to stay on track here. So maybe actually I kind of want to switch things up because I was going to talk about I thought maybe the next thing we would talk about was fat sources, but I think we can come back to that because what I would like to move on to is it seems more appropriate to talk about some of the benefits of fat, what fat does, why it's not necessarily bad, right? We've talked about, we've touched on some of the, the bad stuff, but in reality, we need fat, we need dietary fat. Sorry, we need lipids. And so I think let's get into the benefits. Let's get into what fat actually does for us and some of those things. You good with that?
Yeah.
We know like energy. They're a big source of energy. Another thing that, and this is very common in the group and a lot of our moderators will say this. They'll say you need to have a certain fat minimum, and we don't necessarily know what that is, but there is a somewhere there's a minimum amount of fat that you need because they drive things like hormone production is a big one. And I kind of want to, before we go into the other benefits, let's hone in on that one just because it's thrown around so much in the group. When we talk about fats being beneficial for hormone regulation, as we often say in the group, what do we actually mean, right? Because fats are a large structural component of hormones, like hormone production, right? And things like sex hormones, right? Estrogen and testosterone, and those play a pretty big role in things like mood, reproductive health, muscle function. So if we don't get adequate fat intake, then yeah, it does impact hormone production, and hormones can become imbalanced. It can impair your well-being. So What do we mean by that when we say that one of the benefits of fat is hormone regulation? And why is that important?
Yeah, so I think to really understand and kind of unpack that, I think the first place to start actually is understanding fat as a storage, a
Okay.
form of stored energy, and a little bit of how it's used in producing some of the sex hormones. I want to start with just like a brief explanation of that, and then I'll kind of give you my insights into it, because I think there's my intuition on it is maybe a little bit different than other people's. And
Okay.
I don't know if I'm right, but I want to kind of just lay the groundwork. So the average human has, in terms of like, just we have three energy systems, right? We have the creatine phosphate system, we have glycolysis, and we have fat metabolism, aerobic oxidation, whatever you want to call it. Everybody has a different name for those. We have the equivalent of probably about, I don't know, 20 to 50 grams of creatine stored in our body at any given time, right? Which is enough to produce about 10 seconds of ATP. We store 400 to 800 grams of carbohydrates in our body at any given time. And if you actually do the math of how many grams of sugar are in your blood at a given time, it's like less than the equivalent of a sugar cube diluted throughout your entire body. So it's like pretty minimal. So we have about 1,600 to 3,200 calories of stored carbohydrates in our body at any given time. That's not very many.
No.
But we have anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 calories of stored fat in our body at a given time. That's days, weeks, a month worth of energy expenditure, right? Okay. That's all stored as triglycerides. A lot of our hormones, specifically our sex hormones, are all derived off of cholesterol, right? So estrogen, testosterone, they all kind of share these production pathways that have different enzymes. I'll see if I can pull up the chart, but they're all based on a sterol backbone, which is cholesterol. Sex hormone conversion charts. I'm just going to see if I can pull this up just so I can show people. I'll see if I can find this while we're talking about this. It's less based on, in my opinion, total fat intake and more to do with how much like the overall cholesterol status of our body.
Right.
One of the more interesting differences between men and women is we naturally have different levels of body fatness, and it actually has more to do with structural and hormonal pockets of fat than it has to do with subcutaneous like body fat adipose tissue, right? Like we know that women have more adipose tissue in their breast tissue than men. They have more adipose tissue around their hips and butt than men. They have less androgen receptors in their upper body than men. So these kind of site specific that are related to hormones and where fat accumulates. And in my opinion, that is more structural functional than stored energy, right? And also a little bit different in terms of like overall body leanness. Obviously you have like, there's hormone differences of why men are naturally leaner than women, like visually. There's a lot of things there, but I think that's an important point to notice. So one of the questions that comes up a lot, and I'll get to my point here, is this idea that there's a minimal amount of dietary fat intake that is required to support sex hormone production, especially among women. I actually think it has more to do with the overall energy status of your body over an extended period of time and your overall general metabolic healthiness than the exact amount of fat you consume in a day. So for example,
that makes sense.
If you consume a very, very low fat diet for a long period of time, 10% of calories or less, your likelihood of being in an energy surplus is very low, right? That means that you're going to be in a state of energy deficiency for an extended period of time, which means your body will have lower levels of cholesterol available because cholesterol levels are generally tied to energy status. So you're going to have less cholesterol available to make sex hormones. Additionally, when you consume a low fat diet, you're consuming less cholesterol, which we know is not directly tied to blood levels of cholesterol, but you're also then getting fewer omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, and fat-soluble vitamins. So I'm of the kind of thought process where that daily minimum amount of fat requirement is probably more related to overall energy status and overall metabolic health than it is that fat number per se. Now, I could be completely wrong, and there could be some minimal amount where triglycerides actually directly affect cholesterol levels and sex hormone production, and that's like the one-to-one thing, but I'm going to guess it's actually the other one because we don't
And that's what I mean. I don't think we know, right? Like we don't. It's just a guess. Like there's.
It's the corollary for carbohydrates is we know within a relatively narrow window how low your carbohydrate intake has to be for how long before you start producing ketones, which basically signals a shift in metabolism away from carbohydrates. Right. We don't know what that correlate is for fats and changes in sex hormones. We just don't. And I don't know if I've seen any studies that have looked at being in an isocaloric state or a calorie surplus while having very low fat intakes, if there's any downregulation of sex hormones. I don't know of any data that has shown that.
But we know that there is, well, the point is fats are important, and that's one of the things that it's important for. So hormone regulation. So the other, and there's obviously more to it than just that. You mentioned energy. You started off with that, and I actually think that fats. We usually recommend this to our clients. At least I did in the past when I was working with people. Is fats are usually more beneficial, or you would probably want more dietary fat if you're an endurance athlete, for example, right? Or if you're doing, like low intensity exercise, like walking, light physical tasks. It's a longer lasting energy source, right? So there are times when it's beneficial for your activities depending on what you're doing. You've got things like nutrient absorption, the 4 fat soluble vitamins, right? A, D, E, K. It's not that we can still absorb those things, but along with sufficient fat, we can absorb those things better, right? And I think there's also the bioavailability factor where you've got antioxidants and phytonutrients that are in foods are better absorbed in the presence of dietary fats, right? So there's more to it. There's things like just absorbing more nutrients and cell function and a whole slew of other things as to why fats are important. What would you say, like in terms of if maybe list of importance? Doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3, but like what are the biggest things that we need, biggest reasons we need fats?
I think the big ones are actually less related to calories and more related to the nutrient side. So I think it has more to do with making sure you're getting enough fat soluble vitamins absorbed. I think consuming omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, those things are really important. I think a lot of the relatively healthy sources of fat come with some other important micronutrients as well. Like some of the polyphenols sometimes end up coming in your diet from some of the good sources of fat. So I think it has more to do with that than specifically them as a direct fuel source for your body. Because if you really think about it, I mean, we're storing these in our body and they're being released. So a lot of times what your body's using is also coming from stored fat, and then what you're eating is getting pushed back into storage. So it's a little bit of like they just end up becoming energy.
So I have two questions. One is something you just mentioned, but the two questions I have are if fat intake drops, does that affect? I assume it does cellular communication, right? Because fats, particularly phospholipids, are big. They're like the primary component of your cell membrane, right? And so they help cells.
Yeah, but your
nutrient
body will
exchange.
manufacture those, right?
So that's kind of leads to what I was going to ask. So if you are deficient in fats and you're losing weight, let's say you've got weight to lose, so that you have a lot of body fat. When your dietary intake for fat is low, is that atoned for by the body fat? Like, is it kind of like, well, I don't need as much dietary fat because I'm pulling from adipose tissue, or does it not really work like that?
It's a little bit hard for me to answer that question, and I'll give you a kind of just a thought experiment. Let's say somebody loses 100 pounds. That means they have been in a pretty massive What's 3,500 times 100? Is that, I don't even know what the math is. Is that 350,000 or is that 35,000? 350,000.
350,000, yeah.
Okay, so that person is effectively, rough math, in a negative 350,000 calorie deficit, of which almost all of that is coming from body fat, right? Let's call it 80%. So they've lost 80%. So they've lost 80 pounds of lipids in their body, but their cell membranes aren't like falling apart, right? Their cells are still communicating. Their brain is still working. They're still producing hormones. So I think the story on dietary fats translating like 1-to-1 in the body, at least in the acute sense, to what the functions are, I think it's not quite the same as consuming a carbohydrate and then it going into being stored and used as energy. So I think dietary fats are a little bit different just in terms of like how they map 1-to-1 structure function.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Another benefit that I don't know when this came on to, I just remember like growing up and seeing the news, like omega-3s became this big thing. When I started looking into it and when I started taking nutrition more seriously, you find out things like, okay, the brain is probably more than half fat, right? Like that's what the brain's composed of mostly. And so getting these omega-3s can really help brain health and potentially protect against age-related decline. Like, aren't there like there have been claims like that adequate, good fats are anti Alzheimer's, right? Can protect against things like Alzheimer's. Is it really as simple as the increase in fat, just having that circulating in your blood is like, it's just good for your brain because those fats are there? Like, do you know the mechanism behind that? Why is that? Like, what's the science behind that? Why it's good for your brain, other than just to say it's the same reason it's good for all your cells? Is it really not much more than that?
I haven't spent a ton of time on the neurobiology side of omega-3s. I would imagine it's more to do with the general kind of anti-inflammatory,
right, okay,
health, etc., than anything specific. But I would have to go double check that because I have not spent a ton of time specifically on omega-3s and neurobiology. That just hasn't been interested in. But I think it has more to do with cell membrane structure, inflammatory processes, etc.
Do you take omega-3s, fish oil pills or anything?
I do take omega-3.
I'm pleased to let you know that you don't need to take omega-3s anymore. And in fact, you can substitute with just butter. In fact, I took a brief second to have, I'll share my screen.
Oh my God.
To have chat. Did you know that Bob Ross actually drew Memories of Butter? Here's his painting, Memories of Butter.
I love how there's also a picture of butter in the background. And the like little paint palette thing has butter. Oh my God.
Yeah. So there you go. Memories of butter is what that one's called.
Chat GPT's ability to make pictures is basically what you would expect a toddler to do if you told them something and they took everything literal.
The best is when it comes up with like drawings that like there's random things in there that you're like, what the hell is that? Like I don't even know what that is. Like it just half the pictures don't make sense. It's kind of interesting too when you tell it to make a picture, you get a really good understanding that AI doesn't really understand what you're saying. If it did, that picture would make sense.
Yeah.
Anyways, so let's get into. I do want to bust some myths as well. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss on the benefits of fat and why we need them before we move on? Because I kind of want to bust some myths if you don't.
Bust it.
Let's get into some myths, and then we're going to answer some questions that we've gotten in the group. And by the way, for you guys who are listening, post your question in the chat too. We can see those in real time, and we'll be happy to answer those. I did make a post in our Facebook group too. If you want to go ask the question there, you're welcome to do that. So some of the myths: fats bad for you. Obviously, it's not bad for you. Like anything, too much of something, it can become bad for you, and it depends on that's when you need to take context into consideration and how does the rest of your life look like and how does the rest of your diet look like. Obviously, I guess what the myth, I'm more interested in where that myth came from. If you remember back to, it must have been the 90s, late 90s, maybe early 2000s, maybe even sooner than that. It was the whole low fat diet craze, right? Everyone was like, low fat this, keep your fats low. Where the hell did that come from? Do we know?
Yeah, so I think there's two major reasons, at least from my perspective and understanding the history of kind of medical literature and the nutrition science literature. It comes from two things. One is kind of in the 60s, 70s, the initial investigations of saturated fat maybe being linked to increased cardiovascular disease risk, regardless of the actual data there. That's a different discussion. But that was kind of what set us into this, dietary fats may not be great for us, right? Then it came into the late 80s, early 90s, where people really started to focus on the energy density of fats, where they do have, 9 calories per gram versus 8, which is slightly more than double. I think it's like 120%, whatever the math ends up being. So you're more likely to overconsume calories. So that's where this kind of focus on having low-fat diets was. Now, what's really interesting is if you dig into the actual literature from the 90s, some of the science there was very interesting and really good. There's a book. I don't have a physical copy. I have a PDF of it, but it's basically, it kind of goes through a lot of the data, the biochemical data, and the outcome-based randomized trials, and they looked at what is the actual true effect of what percent of your diet comes from dietary fat? What is that effect on total calorie intake in a day? And how does that affect your net calorie balance over time? And what's interesting is as you increase your percent of your diet that comes from dietary fat, your overall calorie intake goes up because they are more energy dense. And in kind of more modern society, if you're not mindfully paying attention to what you're eating, the more fats you consume, the more total calories you're likely to consume. Now, that's not true for everybody, but that is true in the larger sense of the literature. So this is where the push for low-fat diets and low-fat products came from. Now, the hard part about that is when you think about the food that we consume, the dietary fats that were swapped out in a lot of these industrialized products were what gave these foods good mouthfeel and shelf stability. So what we had to do to make them taste good and have the same mouthfeel is we had to load them up with more preservatives and more sugar. So we maybe offset the calorie density of a lot of our foods slightly, but we increased the tastiness and the palatability of these foods. So we actually didn't really net that fewer calories across the entire population.
You know what really sucks? Sorry if anyone is listening that likes low-fat ice cream, but I'm just going to say low-fat ice cream is.
You know what the hard part about it is? It's not the taste; it's the texture.
Well, yeah, I mean that's part of it. Like the whole thing, it's not the same. I gotta have full fat ice cream, baby. And I know you're a big ice cream guy, so I know you feel the same. I want how much of the. I also think that this is just my hunch. I don't have any scientific data on this, but just the fact that fat is called fat, the word fat makes us like. I think the general public thinks that fat is like look at my body fat, right? And so if I consume fat, that's going to turn into fat. So I think just the fact that it's called.
But isn't it weird that in the last 20 years, like the opposite is true? People associate carbohydrates with body fat, not dietary fat. So I think it's more of just. I think it has less to do with that and more to do with just what is the prevailing message.
But what I'm saying is, at some point at different points in the progression of a species, you know there are these things that come out that the general public believes, and then you move past them. I think maybe in the 90s, one of the things that we thought was fat turns into fat. We didn't think about carbohydrates. We didn't think about protein. It was just, dietary fat must be why I'm storing fat. So I got to eat less fat.
But scientifically speaking, that is correct because dietary fats are stored with much greater efficiency as body fat than anything else.
This is true. But again, the myth was, not even considering calorie intake. Just if I eat more fat, I'm going to get fat. Oh, Stuart Martin's here. Stuart, should I read it in Irish? Should I read it in
No, do not embarrass us.
No. I could do it in the Scottish one. He said, I tried low/no-fat Pringles a few years ago in Cali. We don't have them here. They tasted okay, but man, did I suffer later on that day. Give me the real stuff any day of the week. Yeah, I don't know. I don't like Pringles either way, so I can't comment on that. But I feel like low/no-fat Pringles would be dry as hell. Or maybe I'm wrong. Have you ever had low-fat Pringles?
No, but I'm just looking at the ingredients, dude. That'd give me a. Yeah.
You don't. Do you remember when they loaded things up with what was it?
Orlistat?
Oh yeah. No. Olestra.
Olestra.
Yeah. And
Orlistat's a drug.
This. I'm not saying anything inappropriate here. I'm just speaking. This is the medical term that they said it caused anal leakage was the thing that it caused. I'm like,
why would you need to bring that up?
I'm just saying that's what they said. Olestra was causing, so they took it out of people's food. Like, why was that in food? Yeah,
dude, I don't know. We've made some awesome choices as a society around food before.
I know. All right, so we can probably spend the rest of the time here answering some questions. Hopefully, let me go back and look at my post. I got to make sure I know we got a couple. Hopefully, we got a bunch. And again, I'll just say if you guys have questions, fire them away in the chat. I made a post in the Facebook group for that, but if you're not there, you can just ask them right here. Oh, Tyler Drummond said, "This isn't football. This isn't fat related, but he said favorite football team." He wants to know if you have a favorite football team, Brad.
No.
Let Brad tell you about how much he loves football.
I don't watch football.
This dude dogs on me. Tells me that football is just like so inferior to him and so inferior to basketball.
It was I was on a phone call the other day with somebody. He's an ex-NHL hockey player, and I told him that it's really funny that you guys have to wear pads. It was so funny.
Did he laugh?
Yeah.
I like it.
Then he showed me his missing tooth, so it was fine.
Yeah, some of them are real.
All right, let's get back to business here.
Hold on.
Let's give the people what they want.
My favorite team's the Vikings. He wanted to know, so I had to tell him.
Did you say the Packers? Is that what you said?
No. So Lindsay has a real question. What are the implications of not getting enough fats in your diet? And are all fats created equal from a nutrition fitness standpoint? You want to answer that two-parter?
Yeah, so I think we answered the first one a little bit. I think the risks that are associated with not getting enough fat, I think, are going to come first from not getting enough fat-soluble vitamins in your diet. So you're going to notice things related to vitamin A, D, E, or K, insufficiency or deficiency. Two, you may notice some things that arise from not having enough omega-3s or omega-6s, like maybe some immune things, some dry skin, just things that are associated with low omega-3 or omega-6. And then the last one I would say is probably having low sex hormones. We talked about maybe if they're one-to-one related or not, but those are the things you're going to see. Now, in terms of like how your food choices affect it, I've actually kind of thought about this quite a bit over the years, and my answer will change from time to time based on how data comes out. But here's the recommendation that I make to people when we talk about choosing fat sources. What I tell people is try to choose fat sources that are nutrient dense. And so what I mean by that is if you can get most of your fats from your foods and not oils, probably a good idea, right? So if you eat things like full fat dairy, it's coming with things like calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, etc. If you're getting it from avocados, olives, even butter, you're getting vitamins A, E, D, and K. If you're getting it in fish, you're getting omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So the more that you get it from foods versus oils, the better. So nutrient-dense sources of fats are important. Try to limit the amount of fats you get from processed foods as much as you can within reason, right? You don't need to eliminate processed foods, but like don't get most of your dietary fats from that. And then the last piece is I actually generally tend to agree with from a risk perspective, the American Heart Association's recommendation of trying to keep saturated fat below about 10% of your total daily calories per day. So for most people, that's probably 20 grams of saturated fat a day or less, I think, if that's the math, because that'd be about 200 calories a day, which would be about 22 grams of saturated fat. So that's like a steak, some eggs, a couple things of yogurt, like some cheese. Like you don't have to eliminate it, but like your breakfast shouldn't be 9 eggs. Your lunch shouldn't be a Philly cheesesteak sandwich, and your dinner shouldn't be 5 pounds of pepperoni. Like,
So but I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. Does that actually matter if you're in a calorie deficit though? Right? Because we talk about being a healthy body weight, being in a calorie deficit to lose weight improves your health markers. So when it comes to the specifics or the composition of where of your food, does that actually matter in comparison to that being in a deficit and having a healthy body weight?
so my perspective on that is it has to do with the relative risk reduction of what you're doing. So if you go from a body weight of 250 to a body weight of 150 while you're eating huge amounts of saturated fat, your overall risk of cardiovascular disease is probably going down because your LDL to HDL levels are
Right.
getting better. Your triglycerides are getting better. Your blood sugar is getting better. Your BMI is getting better. Like all of the major risk factors are getting better.
Right.
So the effect that the saturated fat being high may impact your metabolic parameters is probably minimal compared to all the other things. Now, if you are otherwise at a good BMI, you're doing all the other things, then it becomes a more high ROI decision. But generally speaking, making the food choices that end up aligning with that also generally tend to align with all the other things.
Another question we got was, how do cooking oils differ and which ones are the healthiest to use? Which is interesting because isn't there something about when maybe it has to do with smoking point. I think there are different fats that maybe aren't great for cooking and ones that are. And I also seem to remember something about I can't remember which. Maybe it was coconut oil. Like if you cook with it, it like becomes somehow worse during the cooking process. I don't know if I'm just pulling that out of thin air, but I thought there was something to that there are certain oils you should avoid cooking with. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
So when we talk about cooking with oil, it primarily has to do with one, kind of the overall health profile, nutrient profile of the oil, right? That's the first thing. The second piece is how you're cooking it, right? So you could take something like refined peanut oil. Basically has no real, well, some of them maybe do. I haven't looked at this in a while. Most of them don't have very many like health benefits, right? They're not like high in vitamins, vitamin E, pretty much nothing. It's very nutrient poor, but it does have a very high smoke point, which is why you use it in frying, right? You can get it hot without it oxidizing and burning. Avocado oil also has a high smoke point, but it generally is less processed and refined and generally has more fat soluble vitamins in it. So if you're going to have if you're going to make a salad dressing with avocado oil, it's probably a little bit better than peanut oil, right? Okay. Now let's talk about the smoke point. Olive oil is probably a better health choice for you if it's cold and you're dipping bread in it than peanut oil. If you're deep frying something, the olive oil is going to smoke at a lower temperature and it's going to oxidize, and those oxidized chemicals end up actually causing issues in your body later. So it's a little bit of, you have to consider both in what you're doing. Ideally, you just don't cook things, you don't deep fry things very often. You don't cook them at super high temperatures when there's a lot of oil involved, ideally.
That is correct.
Was that not audible for you?
I heard it. I just chose to ignore it.
Thank you. Another question we had was, lost my spot. Hang on. Yeah. Does eating fat affect cholesterol levels? And if so, how? Which is different because we did an episode on cholesterol levels and we talked about dietary cholesterol doesn't really impact overall, serum cholesterol levels. And so what is that? Can we say the same about fat? And I said, I'm going to imagine that it's also context dependent, right? Like, I mean, within your overall lifestyle. But what do you say about that?
Yeah, so if we kind of take everything else and hold it constant and say your body weight's stable, you're not losing or gaining huge amounts of weight, generally speaking, consuming trans fats will raise your LDL a little bit. It'll also decrease your HDL. That's not great. Saturated fats will have a small impact on your LDL levels. Now, whether that directly translates to cardiovascular disease risk is another discussion, but we do know that if you consume diets higher in saturated fat, it will increase your LDL levels a little bit. However, there's some evidence. Yes, acute and chronic. I'd have to go back and look at some of the kinetics on that, but yes. However, there are some arguments to be made that actually it doesn't have a meaningful effect. What the real effect is, when you replace dietary saturated fat with poly and monounsaturated fats, you lower your LDL.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a little bit of a debate out there whether it's more of you get reductions through removal than eating it increases it. I think a lot of that's basically a lot of semantics, and it probably depends on the person and their status and what's going on. And here's what I would tell people. Diets that tend to be higher in whole food sources of poly and monounsaturated fats like fish, olives, olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocados, things like that, and have modest amounts of, fats from red meat, fats from other saturated fats that are, so not zero, but like modest intakes, generally tend to have better lipid profiles than diets that are very high in saturated fats and very low in the unsaturated fats. That's what I would say.
By the way, Stuart says, if you cook kale in coconut oil, it makes it easier to slide it into the trash. The kale.
He's wrong.
He's dogging on kale. Do you remember the whole kale craze? The lies
we tell ourselves.
One of the questions that I've got this one twice. Is I'm thinking about doing keto. Do you recommend? Should I avoid? What are your thoughts on keto, Doc? Have you ever done keto yourself? Have you ever tried it?
Yeah, I tried it.
How did you feel on it?
For me, it was not great.
Was
trying to do any sort of high intensity exercise, like play basketball on it.
That's what I was going to ask. If you were, were you trying to play sport on that? Because I could see that would not be a good time. What are your thoughts on the keto diet?
I mean, I think for some people it can be an easy tool to help manage calorie intake, and it restricts your decision making to a few foods. I don't think it's a great long-term tool for most people. I think there's many times where it ends up being a shortcut to what you were going to have to do anyways, and delays the process of really understanding good long-term nutrition habits. That being said, I think sometimes it can be used as a way to kickstart things, to make pretty abrupt changes, to maybe help you really evaluate the food choices you're making. And I've even coached a lot of clients through it. It would not be my first tool to use, but it can be a tool for sure.
Wasn't it also, was it not originally developed, for lack of a better word, for people to manage epilepsy? Wasn't that something that they used
primarily it for? Kids. It was primarily intractable pediatric epilepsy was what it was developed for. And what's most interesting is the ketogenic diet that we hear in popular culture that was developed from that is not even remotely close to what it actually looks like. The actual ketogenic diet that's used for people with intractable epilepsy is like maybe the most unsustainable, awful diet you can imagine. I mean, it is literally 80 to 85% of your calories come from fat. So that means if you were to eat ground beef, like 80-20 ground beef, you would have to cook it, keep all of the fat, take most of the ground beef out, and then eat all of that. Like that
does not sound
like
enjoyable.
If you go read the literature of the actual diets that are used in these studies, and I have a friend of ours, they had a daughter who was struggling with this, so she was utilizing this diet to help her, and they were like, dude, this is crazy. Like, we have to take her vegetables because she can't eat any sort of starches. So when she has vegetables at dinner, and they melt a stick of butter and dump it over there so she gets enough calories a day. Like, that's maybe not a full stick, but that's kind of what it looks like. So the current ketogenic diet that most people follow is really a moderate protein, low carbohydrate, moderate fat diet. They're not really following true medical ketogenic diet, nor should they be. Like, that's crazy.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so you can just tell me if we don't have enough time to explain, but I'd be curious to hear why keto for epilepsy? What's the mechanism behind that? Is that a short answer, or would we need more time? Like, I don't understand what's the benefit.
So we would need more time, and I'd have to go back and do a little bit more digging because it's been a while since I've really spent any time on it. But primarily what it has to do with is decreasing the deviations in metabolism in the brain. Right, so our body goes from metabolizing carbohydrates to fats based on what we've eaten, based on whatever. So basically, it's trying to level out changes in the brain, metabolically speaking, because changes in metabolism can cause changes in, electrochemical gradients. Well, it's more like electrochemical gradients, the sensitivity of the on-off action potential. I think it has to do with that, if I remember correctly, but I'd have to go double check, and we would need a expert who is not me.
Michelle Grace gave you props. She said, Brad, you're a really great teacher. You explain things so even I can understand them. Thank you. Good job, dude. Proud of you, man.
Thanks, fam.
It was either you or I was going to have Jay Woith, be the co-host of the show. But I was like, I don't know.
He's far more entertaining than I am. That is very true.
He'd be eating goldfish on every single show. And I just, I don't know. He's a crazy dude. Hey, Jay, if you're watching, love you, bro. Well, that's we just hit our time, and I know you probably need to go eat something because I bet you haven't eaten anything all day.
I have
So-
been. This is now my 6th straight hour of talking on my computer, and my back really hurts from my chair. Ugh.
Well, I'll let you go about the rest of your day, and I will let everyone else who's watching go about the rest of their day as well. Natalie says, "Appreciate your time. Now to implement what I've learned." Yes, go do that.
Did you say not to implement what I learned, or now to implement? What I
Not now to implement. What
I
I've
thought you
learned.
said not to. And I was like,
No.
you know what? I appreciate her boldness and her honesty.
If I misspoke and said not to, then that was my bad. But no, she did not say that.
When you go edit this episode back and fix your mic level, you'll have to let me know.
I sound just fine now. I don't need to hear that. All right. On that note, we're out. Hey, just you guys want to hear an awesome poem? Like I said, go back and watch the beginning of this episode. I wrote Brad a poem, and he about cried. He thought it was very sweet.
What a train wreck of an episode. Thank you guys for bearing with.
We talked about poems. We talked about Bob Ross. We talked about butter. Man, this was a train wreck, wasn't it? But it was, that's why we're here. Thank you.
This is why they pay us the big bucks. This is why we have TV deals.
This is also, this is going to be a tough act to follow next week. I don't know how we're going to top this one. So we got to come up with something really good.
Yeah.
So, all right, we're out of here. Thank you everyone for watching. Peace out.